only get to vote once. A, B, C, or D. The thickness of a hair, 1. The thickness of a piece of paper, the thickness of a bacteria, 1. The thickness of an atom, 1. 2. Only 4 of you voted. You're not going to win if you're not going to vote. Okay, over here. Thickness of a hair, 3. Thickness of a piece of paper, 2. Thickness of bacteria, 2. Thickness of an atom. 1, 2, 3. So there were 3 over here, 3 over there. You didn't vote first time. I was counting this side. Okay. The answer is the human eardrum is designed so sensitive that a sound wave moves at 1/1000th of an inch, the diameter of the smallest known atom. We can detect it as sound. A hair is 0.02 inches. A sheet of paper is 0.0002. A bacteria is 0.0002. A hydrogen atom is 0.00000002 inches. That's all the eardrum has to move, and the brain knows it's a sound. So, anyway, that was a tie. Let me just I got to break the tie. Okay. Bible critics doubted the existence of writing before the time of Moses. What discovery proved these Bible critics wrong? They found an ancient library in the city of Ur. They found the Rosetta Stone. They found a list of Phoenician royalty or the scrolls from the Library of Alexandria. Which one of these things showed even older writing than Moses? Okay, we'll go this side first. How many think, remember, you can only vote once, the library they found in the city of Ur? 3, the Rosetta Stone. The Phoenician list of royalty, 4. The scrolls in the Library of Alexandria. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that was the majority, was D. Okay, how about over here? The library in the city of Ur. Oh, I don't even have to go any further. That's the majority. Okay, so here's the little tidbit of fun information. That's the right answer. Remember where Abraham came from? Long before Moses. They had a library filled with documents. No writing before the time of Moses. Everything the Bible says is true. Ur is the ancestral home of Abraham, in existence over 3,900 years ago. One of the earliest civilizations after the flood. This library had thousands of stone books, some of which were scholarly, some books the ordinary person would read. Many were written up to 1,000 years before Moses was born. So, okay, last quickie. The Earth's magnetic field protects us from harmful radiation from the sun. It is known to be decaying. Based on 150 years of observation, at some point the field gets so weak, people will not be able to survive. What's the oldest possible age for the Earth given the rate at which our magnetic field is decaying? 1 billion years, 1 million years, 100,000 years, 10,000 years? You guys are first. It's decaying how fast before it's gone? 10,000, 100,000, million, billion. Which one? A, B, C, or D? Billion, million, 100,000, or 10,000? Who? B, 1 million? D, 10,000. How about over here? Oh, you guys are too good, too well taught. But most people would not even connect this, and that's the point of having this game and playing it with people. The Earth's magnetic field is decaying at a measured rate. It loses half its strength every 1,400 years. 10,000 years, it would have been so strong, life couldn't have existed. 10,000 years from now, it'll be too weak for life to exist. Despite over 100 years of attempts, there's no explanation for how the Earth's magnetic field could increase by any natural process. So there's just all this evidence. Things aren't as old as we're told, and that's just one of them. So, all right, I wanted to introduce you to that fun game. It includes 2 books where you can find the answers, a closer look at the evidence, a closer look at prophecy. And while we're waiting, I just wanted to warm up the crowd. So, okay.
Well, we're going to sing a couple songs to get started. We're going to start with 464, How Firm a Foundation, Ye Saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. Not in the science textbooks, some of the science textbooks. 464, Let's sing How Firm a Foundation. Let's stand. Let's stand as we sing. Ready? How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you who has said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Fear not, I am with thee, oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous omnipotent hand. Let's sing the fourth as our last. The soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul the whole hell should endeavor to shake. I'll never forsake. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the wonderful chance tonight to come and be strengthened in our faith. And I pray you'd bless our speaker tonight, help him to speak with clarity, and help us to listen with attentiveness. And may you help us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, standing on the promises, 445, standing on the promises of Christ, my King. Through eternal ages, let his praises ring. Let's sing together. 445, we'll sing verse 1 and verse 4. Standing on the promises of Christ, my King, through eternal ages, let his praises ring. Glory in the highest, I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises, I cannot fall, listening every moment to the Spirit's call, resting in my Savior as my all in all, standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. Thank you. May be seated.
We're delighted that you're here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. You're in for a treat. I want to remind you about the schedule tomorrow. There's 2 sessions in the morning and 2 sessions in the afternoon, 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. These are our chapel sessions, and so students will say pledges, and they'll run a little bit longer than normal. Then in the afternoon, after lunch, everybody's tired. The sessions will be a little shorter, 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And so for the secondary, it's 9 and 2. Those are geared for adults, and then the children ones are 10:30 and 1 o'clock, and those are geared for children. You're invited to come. We encourage you to come. Invite others. Bring other people with you, and we're delighted that you're here tonight. I do have tonight. I'm prepared to give special offering. And if you want to give special offering, stick it in the envelope, in the offering plates at the back. We'll make sure that everything that's given designated goes for our special speaker. Bruce, you come. We're delighted to have you. Thank you so much. Enjoyed your presentations this morning, and delighted to have you.
All right, let's warm up my computer. Thank you, Tim. Okay. See if I can wake it up. All right. Okay. Well, it didn't wake up. It locked up. Try it again. There we go. All right, one of my favorite talks. I'm going to talk over the next 50 minutes about discoveries that have been made that have changed the entire course of human history. All of humanity has been changed and benefited from things that have been discovered based on what God has made out there in nature. Now, there's all sorts of drugs and chemicals and antibiotics and little things that we've tried to copy that have been pretty cool. But these are the big things I'm going to talk about tonight. But I want to start by looking at the very first thing that God told the very first people He ever made, Adam and Eve, to do. And it's such an important command, theologians even have a name for it. They call it the dominion mandate. And it comes right out of Genesis, right, the very first chapter of the Bible. God looked at Adam and Eve. He said He blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, replenish. And by the way, that word that we translated in the 1500s as replenish, it literally, 500 years ago, it meant fill. It didn't mean that all life had been wiped out by something in the past and then suddenly it needed to be refilled. That word literally was understood to mean fill the earth at the time it was written. But this is what I'm getting to. God told people to have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now, that old English word that was translated from some Hebrew word, it has the essence of it, the original word, has to study, to understand, to control creation. The birds, the beasts, everything God has made. He gave human beings the privilege and the command to study, understand, and control what He had made. Now, God is outside of time. God knows everything every person is ever going to do. He knows every atrocity, every culture was ever going to commit. He knows everything that sin is ever going to lead to. And He knows what people are going to do. They're going to hoard creation. They're going to steal things from other people. They're going to covet it. They're going to turn it into things they're going to worship. They're going to pollute it. They're going to destroy it. They're going to waste it. And yet He gave us control over creation. So again, as an engineer and a scientist, I'm always asking myself, why? Why would God do that? Now, the Bible actually answers that. There's two specific verses that make it really clear why God would told us to take dominion, study, understand, and control creation. The first one is found in Romans, and it's kind of the key verse of my whole ministry. And I use this in every seminar I give. And it goes on, but I'm only going to give you Romans verses 19 and 20. God has told us that that which may be known about Him is manifest or obvious to every human being. Everybody who has two eyes, two ears, and two hands can see, feel, and touch the things that God has made. God has shown it to them. The invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by what He has made. We can even understand God's power and His nature, His Godhead, by looking at what He's made. So every human being is without excuse for belief in God. In essence, science is studying, understanding, and controlling creation. That is what science is. God told us to go do science. Why? Because the natural world operates by the scientific principles God set up. But there's certain things that could never happen. Now, tomorrow, for the senior high kids, the secondary school, I'm going to give an example from astronomy, an example from biology, an example from geology of things that could never have happened naturally. They had to have been done by God because they couldn't happen naturally. That protein molecule I strung out, the parts of a pin that could never come together, are like the parts of life that could never come together. And every experiment we do shows us this is true. Something outside of life, something outside of time, matter, space, and energy had to have made things and then brought it together. And by studying science, we can know that. So we study creation to give us that absolute assurance. God is real. There's no other logical explanation. Everything we study shows us that's true. But then there's a second reason. And this one I find in Job, in that long discourse, and I do a whole sermon, hour-long talk on Job and what can be learned from it and the tie to creation. One of the most fascinating and useful books in the whole Bible, because the world is filled with pain and suffering, and there's nuggets in there that help us to get through it. But in the midst of all of it, there's a statement, ask the beasts and they shall teach you, the fowl or the birds of the air and they shall tell thee. So we can learn from creation. That's the other biggie. God is the master designer, the master engineer, the master architect, the genius above geniuses. And when we realize that, we start looking for the kind of things he's done and trying to think, how could we benefit from them? Now I'm going to start, because this talks with the birds of the air, I'm going to start with flight. The idea of where did flight come from? How did we learn to fly? Now, we actually did not have sustained human flight of heavier than air vehicles that we could steer and move, airplanes, until 1902. So for the first 5,900 years of human history, we were looking at birds and wishing we could fly. I mean, how many of you wished you could fly? Did anybody have a reoccurring dream that when young you could fly? Raise your hand, because I'm just curious. I did, over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 or so of you. Reoccurring dream you could fly. How many of you love to make paper airplanes? Just loved watching them fly. All of us. I think Adam and Eve looked at the birds and wished they could fly, but we couldn't. We just couldn't do it. Well, we developed the ability to take pictures in the 1850s. We were taking tintypes of the Civil War. We learned how to string pictures together in the 1880s to create movies. And I found some old vintage 1880 and 1890 and early 1900 movies of mankind's attempts to fly, and I strung them all together. I want you to watch our early attempts to fly. Okay, it's kind of funny, isn't it? What were they all imitating? Birds and wings, but it didn't work. I mean, they had the right shape, they're watching what God made, but it didn't work. Now, you won't find this in any of the textbooks or history books because they just leave it out. But it wasn't until two young inventors who were Christians, their father was a Presbyterian pastor, who understood if God did it, there's got to be principles by which these birds operate that we ought to be able to discover and understand. And they realized you not just have to have the shape of a bird's wings, you have to get that wing moving fast enough, and you have to understand what's going on. You see, because of the shape of a wing, air flowing up over it moves faster, air moving below it moves slower. You get a low pressure area above the wing, a high pressure area below the wing, and that's what gives you lift. and allows a heavier than air object to fly through the air. So they built a very, very light airplane, and you know I'm talking about the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright. And in 1903, for the first time in human history, they figured out how to get that airplane moving fast enough. And I didn't realize this. They attached a big weight to the top of a tower with a cable going down through a pulley and attached to the airplane, so when the weight dropped, the airplane was propelled forward. And that's what got it moving fast enough that then the propeller would keep it flying. And you'll see all this, because first they flew in a straight line, maybe 5 times as long as a sanctuary, maybe 10 times, just straight and back down. Then they went and got a film crew and a bunch of reporters because they wanted to record it. And the next time, both of them climbed on. And watch, I love this film. The first time mankind learned to fly, 1902. Oh, it's 1903. So there goes the weight. And there goes Wilbur and Orville. This time they didn't want to just go in a straight line, so they needed someone to steer. And the weight gets them moving. See, that reporter was so stunned, he dropped down on one knee. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Isn't that just stunningly cool? I mean, they're banking and soaring and going all around the reporters and coming in for a landing. First time mankind could fly after 6,000 years of wishing he could. And that was only 119 years ago. It's like, you know, compared to God, we're not even a little 2-year-old in a sandbox compared to Einstein. There's a million times greater comparison. And yet he gave us the entire earth as our sandbox to play in. And said, enjoy it, learn from it, benefit, use it to help others. And that's what we've done. Now, that's a major technological development, and I think it's there because we looked at what God did first. But it's not just learning to fly. You see, as airplanes got faster and faster, we needed to modify and develop how are they designed. So what we did, we looked at the fastest bird we could find. Now, the early airplanes, okay, well, I'll come back to this in a second. This is the fastest bird in level flight. Now, peregrine falcons will dive at over 200 miles an hour, but in level flight, nothing flies faster than the swift. It's aptly named. It's the swift bird. Flies 104 miles an hour. They've tracked these things. They fly almost continuously. Even well into the nighttime, they'll keep flying. They believe they fly about 2.5 million miles in their lifetime. It's like 8 times all the way to the moon, around and back again, or 100 times around the entire earth. They don't stop to drink. They don't want to take time to land. They will just, and I've seen them do this, they will swoop down, open their mouths on a river or a lake, scoop up some water, and keep on flying without ever landing. They don't stop to eat, they just eat bugs in the air. That's how they get their food. They don't even stop to sleep. This is kind of, they really don't stop. Even lots of times they'll fly all night. Scientists tried to figure out, well, how do they do that? How do they get sleep? Turns out they shut one eye and half of their brain goes to sleep. And after it's rested, they shut the other eye, the other half of the brain goes to sleep. Now don't try that in math class because it won't work for you. Okay? They make babies while flying. They don't even want to stop. They only stop to build a nest and lay the eggs. Bird loves to fly. So as aircraft designers are looking for, how do we design a plane that's really maneuverable and flies really fast? They started looking at the wings of this bird. And you notice these wings are swept back. Well, all the airplanes from the Wright brothers airplanes, the wings were straight out. World War I planes, wings are straight out. World War II planes, the wings are straight out. Early airliners, the wings are straight out. But as we got really fast with jet airplanes and really maneuverable jets and stuff, that wasn't working as well. They literally, and you can check it out in literature, looked at this bird and started designing the wings so they were swept back. And now you have modern airplanes, and all of them have those wings swept back like that because God did it first. And then there's another problem. Now you have really big, really heavy airplanes moving really fast, but the most dangerous part of flight is the landing because you got to slow that big old massive airplane down. If you're landing it at 300 and 400 miles an hour, you need 3-mile long runways. And when you do slow down, you lose lift. You got to keep something heavy moving even faster. And they will crash. Lots of crashes during landing because of something called stalling. That's when an airplane loses lift. It just starts fluttering like a leaf. What did they do? They looked at great big heavy birds, eagles and big old geese and so on. And they noticed as these big birds come in for a landing, they have 2 feathers on the front edge of their wing, and those feathers pop out right as they're coming down. So what did the airplane controllers do? Same thing here. Here's a goose coming in. 2 big feathers pop out. You only put it on the great big birds. We designed airplanes with forward flaps. Those flaps cause more air to go up and over, giving you additional lift. They cause drag if you're moving really fast, but when you slow down, you need them. So we designed the airplanes based on how the birds are designed. One last example. I was out one night. This has been probably 10 years ago. We're going for a walk, and it was like really late dusk. It was getting really dark, and I was on this wide path in the forest with a bunch of trees. And all of a sudden, this enormous object comes flying right past my head. And I didn't know what it was because it was dark. And there was no sound. It's just like you sense it, and it was big. Turned out what had just flown past me was a big old barn owl. Okay, now those birds have about 4 or 5 foot wingspans. They're great big birds, totally silent. It was literally the stealth fighter of the bird world. It made no sound. I couldn't detect it. I mean, the mice and rodents and stuff, it's like they don't have a chance because this thing is just like there with its claws and they don't have a clue that it's coming in the dark. Got the great big old eyes. Well, this design led to something really cool. I'm old enough to remember the original computers in the mid-1990s. I think the first one that was called the Commodore 64. Okay? No idea what to do with it. It just sat there. We bought a screensaver for our kids and watched the screensaver on it. We didn't know what a computer was good for. But it was loud. You turn it on and it would go. It wasn't very efficient. It generated a lot of heat. You had these big old fans trying to keep it from burning up. And it was annoying. Well, computer designers were trying to figure out how do you move air without making a whole bunch of sound to keep these computers from burning up. Guess where they looked? They looked at the design of an owl's wing. And what they discovered, and by the way, here's a fan of a modern computer, what they discovered was these wings have a little notch in them at the end. And then the feathers have a very frilly surface. Did lots of innovation and discovered that if you put these notches on the end of these fans and you make them very flexible, all of a sudden as they're bending and going through the air, they don't make near as much sound, and they're much, much quieter because they looked at the owl first. So all of this, I'm just talking about flight first, is something called biomimicry. Bio meaning it's a biological origin, mimic is to copy. So copying something God has made to have an innovation or a development. And it's a rapidly growing area of engineering and medical sciences. Every medical college, every engineering college, they'll have a class on biomimicry because we know we can learn so much from nature. The sad thing is God never gets the credit in a public university. It's always explained by, oh, this thing adapted, this thing evolved, this thing just made itself over time because it's useful. Throwing the word evolution at something just because it's useful and functional is faith. Do the mechanisms, do little changes, allow something to develop that's useful and functional. It's just assumed it does. It's not explained how it could happen 99.99% of the time. They'll just use the word evolution, oh, that explains it. And people are conditioned to just accept that. Okay, now, we're going to move on. What Major technological development happened because somebody looked at an Osage orange tree. Okay, any guesses? And that's what the fruit of this tree looks like. By the way, this invention was made and discovered and developed by a man named Michael Kelly clear back in 1868. I'll give you another clue. Even today, okay, now this invention is now about 140 years old. It sells 200 million pounds a year. And if you stretched it end to end, it would reach 1 million miles. Any guesses what the invention is? Sometimes people say golf balls and golf courses and lay out all the golf balls, they'll reach 1 million miles, and it has nothing to do with sports. Let me give you the background, and you'll get it before I'm done talking. But I got to give you a little history lesson. In I believe it was 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from France because they were raising money for a war with England. It doubled the land area of America. It was called the land purchase of all history, the land bargain of all history. For about 2 cents an acre, he doubled the size of the United States. That's why he sent out Lewis and Clark to find out what was out there and all this land he'd just bought. And it created a migration west of the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. But the government gave away for land for anybody who would go out there, hundreds of acres just for settling on it and living there for a year. But in order to supply people to go and live in this wilderness, you had to have port cities. So St. Louis and Chicago, over a 1 or 2 decade period, turned into enormous cities of hundreds of thousands of people living in an urban area, where before we were largely rural with just very small cities. Well, you got to feed all these people that aren't raising their own food. Cows are one of the most efficient sources of protein, more so than chickens you got to chase all over the place. A cow can feed a lot of people for a long time, but you got to contain them. Now in the east, you had lots of trees, okay, so you could build these picket fences and you could contain your herds. Out west in the Great Plains, you don't want to chase your cows 1,500 miles across the Great Plains trying to corral them. So here's what farmers would do. They would plant Osage orange hedges, which would turn into these tall trees, but they would build basically fences out of long hedges, and different farmers would cordon off different areas to keep different kind of animals. Now the reason it worked is because these trees had these really nasty spikes on them. And just like you wouldn't want to push through a hedge that had those big spikes, neither would a cow. So in a matter of years, you could have a really nice fence that was just going to grow and stay there. But it took years to get your fence. Any idea what this invention is? Barbed wire. Barbed wire. And if you look at that little picture of the Osage orange branch, and then you look at a piece of barbed wire, see the similarity? Matter of fact, Michael Kelly called his company the Osage Orange Barbed Wire Company. And everybody started making it. He became rich. And when I was reading about this, one of the writers in one of the articles, they said the West wasn't tamed by the Colt 66. The West was tamed by barbed wire because it allowed private ownership of large tracts of land where people could profitably make money raising livestock. Without it, it would have taken much longer for the whole western United States to have developed. And worldwide, it's used around the world. Okay, now what can we learn from a wasp nest? Any guesses? By the way, I've got one here. It was a great big wasp nest, okay, but it's kind of fallen apart. And the inside of the wasp nest is right here. Turns out the inventor that came up with an idea of how can I use a wasp nest, he was a Frenchman, went walking in the woods, got stung by a wasp, but instead of getting irritated, and this was back in 1719, he started looking at what that wasp nest was made out of. And he realized it was really, really thin. You could bend it without it breaking. Very, very flat, and it was made by an insect. Guesses? Paper. You realize paper didn't exist back in the 17, 16, 1500s. Everybody that made book bound them out of cloth, old used cloth. The fibers were recast as linen, and you would write on the linen. But they were very expensive. There was no reason to teach people how to read. Nobody could afford books. No purpose would be served. Well, I want you to think about the world today without paper. I mean, without paper, there'd be no photographs that you could print. Well, we don't need those anymore anyway. But again, I mean, what fun would it be making paper airplanes if you had nothing to work with except cloth? Ooh, that was a good one. And paper folding and origami. And then how about books, you know? Anybody know what the first book ever printed was? The Gutenberg Bible. There's only, as I recall, there's only, I think, 40 known original first edition copies left. They're worth in excess of $40 million each. No books without paper. There would be no envelopes. You couldn't send things through the mail. There'd be no bags to wrap presents in. There'd be no junk mail coming in your mailbox. That might be a good thing. I wouldn't be able to print my newsletters. You wouldn't have newspapers. Of course, kids don't know what newspapers are, but I mean, how would you know that Little Caesars has a stuffed crust pizza for $10 without newspapers? All of that stuff. None of it would exist without paper. We'd still be carrying around a pocket full of metal coins because there'd be no money without paper. Think of the world without paper. I mean, how could you have the quicker picker-upper without paper? No paper towels, you got to wipe up the messes. And then, you've got boxes. Amazon.com wouldn't exist without boxes. We'd be shipping stuff around in barrels still. And then the biggie, you want to go out and get leaves? What about the toilet? Still be going out and getting some leaves to wipe with. The world would be totally changed. With no books, there would be I don't think there would have been the Enlightenment, the Reformation of what God's Word really had to say, the scientific revolution. All of that was predicated with people's ability to pass along knowledge, educate the masses, and learn based on what we'd captured on paper. The development of computers wouldn't have been preceded without paper. It's huge because a stupid little bug that stings people made paper. Anwar Rene, he thought, if that bug can do it, how can we do it? He spent 10 years trying to figure out, how does that wasp and those bees do that? And he realized they just dissolve with an alkaline solution and recast the fibers of plants. Now, the Japanese were doing it, but not in a mass-produced way. It wasn't until later that we learned how to do that. Then there's this little beetle, a man named Joseph Buford Cox, 1946 was taking a lunch break, and he noticed as he looked down, he was sitting on a stump, there's this little beetle just chewing away at the wood fibers on that stump. Now, he spent all day working like crazy, sweating in order to do what? He was a lumberjack, to cut down a tree. And he's watching this little beetle do it as efficiently as he could on that scale. So he looked really close. How is this beetle designed? And he realized that it had these two little curved, like scissor-like shapes that slid past one another, and they were curved. And as one slid past the other, it would just slice right through the fiber. Now, all original chainsaws, and they had them in 1946, they were made like crosscut saws, and they would have little pointed teeth. You'd have a pointed teeth angled one way and a pointed tooth angled the other way, and it would, like, by the force of an electric or gasoline-powered motor, just chop its way through the wood. But two men sawing back and forth with a crosscut saw could actually cut faster than these electric chainsaws or these gas-powered chainsaws. So he took that chain and he made it with these little curved teeth. Let's see if I have a close-up. I actually don't have a close-up of that. But the teeth on a chainsaw blade, they're curved back one way, and the next one is curved the other way, so they kind of smoothly slice through the wood leave a little gap, allowing the other one to slice through. It's like 10 times faster than the ones designed on a human just back and forth saw with little pointed teeth. He started the Oregon Chainsaw Company. It's still a top chainsaw maker in the world today, based on what he saw God do first. And he thought, if God can do it, we ought to be able to copy it. Next question. Major technological developments that changed all of human history. What are the smallest bones in the human body? I see you pointing to your ear. I know you got the right answer. It's the 3 little bones, the anvil, the hammer, and the stirrup, because they look kind of like those things. What did these lead to? What invention because of the shape of the bones in a human ear? Well, I'm going to give you a quote by the man who looked at this and realized how to be able to use this in order to do something. Now, this is his quote. I'm not going to tell you who it is yet, but this is what he said when he was asked, how did you figure out how to do what you just figured out how to do? He said, it occurred to me that if a membrane as thin as tissue paper could control the vibration of bones that were immense in size and weight compared to that little tissue paper membrane, why couldn't a larger, thicker membrane vibrate iron in front of an electromagnet? Okay, anybody know what he's describing? A speaker, but not just a speaker, also a microphone. And that gives you the clue, that's Alexander Graham Bell. You see, this is what the ear does. Your eardrum vibrates as much, and that was one of my earlier questions, as much as the diameter of an atom. That little movement moves those 3 bones in concert enough that they amplify the sound, and they move a fluid into which they're embedded. The fluid is filled with little fine hairs, each one that's attached to a nerve signal that goes to the brain. So how that fluid moves those hairs is interpreted as very specific, meaningful sound by the brain. And it all has to be there. Every part has to be in absolutely perfect place, perfect shape, perfect size, perfectly designed and placed. But he was looking at the principle of how it operates. You see, if you take iron and you move it in front of a magnet, or you move a magnet past iron, it will cause electrons to move in a wire attached to the magnetic, structure. Well, as you're moving it, those electronic signals will pulse up and down or back and forth at a given frequency or amplitude. Then at the other end of the wire, if you place iron filings, which will then move another membrane, that membrane will bounce and cause sound waves to come out in the same amplitude and frequency. So literal human sound can be turned into electronic signal and then turned back into sound. And he realized that's what you need for a telephone. You need to convert the sound waves to an electric signal and then reconvert the electric signal back to sound. Every phone has a microphone and a speaker. You need both. Why? Why did he do this? Because Alexander Graham Bell was a vocal physiologist. He wasn't an electrician. He wasn't an electronic scientist. He wasn't involved in inventing things. He had a deaf wife and a deaf mother, and he was really interested in figuring out how does a human ear work. But by understanding that, he developed the telephone. Okay, quiz question. What was the first message transmitted over a wire? Anybody remember? Go on, shout it out. Watson, come here. Perfect answer, perfectly wrong. That is exactly the first message transmitted by a telephone, but the first message transmitted over a wire was by Samuel Morse, an incredibly strong Christian who believed in a recent creation by God, so we ought to be able to study creation, learn things, and develop stuff. He's the one that developed Morse code. That's a message transmitted over wire, dot, dot, dash, 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 dot, 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 transmitted for hundreds or even thousands of miles across the West for decades before the telephone was invented, how we sent messages long term. And I find it really interesting, what was the first message Samuel Morse ever chose to send over a wire? It was the message, what has God wrought? Wrought is an Old English word that means made. What has God made? Because what God has made leads to what we can make. And I think that's really profound. That man who loved the Lord, loved the Bible, gave God credit for everything, decided that should be the first message ever sent over a wire. But think about the world without microphones. I mean, there would be no telephones. There would be no transatlantic cables, no communication over miles. There would be no reason to put up satellites. There'd be no cell phones, no televisions. None of it would exist. All of modern history would be completely different had not Alexander Graham Bell looked at the human ear and realized, I ought to be able to do what God has done. He's told us to take dominion over creation. Now, some just useful inventions, fun stuff. This was invented by another French guy, Georges de Mestral. This one took him 20 years. In 1941, he started working on it because he went for a walk in the woods, and he came back, and there were all these nasty little seed pods stuck all over him and his dog, and it took him like probably an hour to pick them all out. And instead of just getting irritated, he started thinking about it. And he thought, wonder why those little seed pods stick to me so well. Anybody know the invention I'm getting to? Velcro, exactly. He spent 14 years trying and trying and trying. It's now $1 billion industry, 2,500 employees worldwide. And if you look at these Velcro and you look at seed pods, that's what Velcro looks like. And it looks just like the little hooks on these seed pods. Here's just a fun one. What could we learn from a dog's paw? It's kind of interesting. Well, this invention was by a man named Paul Sperry, 1935. He had a Cocker Spaniel, but he loved to sail. And he was out on his sailboat. He noticed as water would wash over the deck, and he would run over to grab a rope, it was slippery. Even with a rough surface, with the water, it would form like a little slip surface, and he would fall. But his Cocker Spaniel would just go run back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and he would never fall. And he happened to look at the bottom of the dog's paw, and he thought, well, my shoes have leather on the bottom. The dog's paw has leather on the bottom. I slip, and he doesn't. What's the difference? And he started to think about it a little bit deeper instead of just going on to some other thought. And he noticed the leather on the bottom of the dog's paw, there's a little V-shaped channel. And then here's a V-shaped channel, and here's a V-shaped channel, and here's a V-shaped channel. And he thought, what would happen if I put those little V-shaped channels on the bottom of my shoe instead of, the idea was the more surface area, the more traction, the better a shoe is going to be. And for hundreds of years, that's how cobblers made shoes. Well, Paul Sperry, he invented deck shoes. And they all have this little herringbone pattern on the bottom of them. By the way, in one way or another, every tennis shoe has the same thing. We often use little dots and little triangular shapes or little circles, but there's always this pattern. It allows the water to channel between it so it's not trapped and forms a slip surface. And every automobile tire, all the early tires were just round, smooth tires. But from the 1940s on, they had this V-shaped herringbone pattern to channel away water. Very useful invention. Now, this is kind of interesting. What was God thinking when he invented a box-shaped fish? I mean, come on. Talk about a lousy design. It must have been a bad day up in heaven, but he's decided, well, I don't need to make it aerodynamically shaped. I'll make it like a box. Science magazine, they looked at this fish, and this is a quote from one of their articles. They said, this fish should swim about as well as a barn should fly. And it's shaped like a box. It's got these teeny little fins. It's like, what's with this? Except, oceanographers noticed lots of times these long, streamlined fish, the waves are just sweeping them back and forth on the coral reefs, and the box-shaped fish are just swimming along just fine, maintaining their position. What's with that? They're the ones that ought to be thrown out of position. So automobile designers started designing these stupid box-shaped cars. What are they thinking? Talk about a dumb design. Well, it turns out, if you do it right, and Daimler Chrysler did this concept car clear back in the late 1980s, where they're as close as they could possibly keep the dimensions, They made a car with exactly the same curves and dimensions as a boxfish. And then they put it in a wind tunnel, and they realized because of where the curves are in the front and in the back, you would get reverse vortexes that would cancel out the drag. And this car had excellent maneuverability, got 70 miles per gallon, incredible aerodynamics. God did it first, and we just copied it. Construction techniques. In 1851, Joseph Paxton, they had what they called the Great Exhibition. It was the original World's Fair, the first World's Fair in London, England. They had a contest of all the architects of the world to design the most fabulous building mankind had ever designed. We're in the middle of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. Mankind can do anything. Lots of money being made on child slave labor and other things, and railroads and oil barons and so on. But the man who won the contest wasn't an architect. He didn't know anything about architecture. He was a botanist. And he thought, if God can design this huge water lily that, a child could sit on it, a man could actually walk from lily to lily, and it's got this real thin membrane, and he doesn't break through, maybe I could design a building based on that. So he designed what was called the Crystal Palace for the original World's Fair in London, England. It was made of 200,000 panes of glass. It was 10 stories high, 110 feet high, covered 18 acres of land. This was an enormous structure. It weighed millions of pounds. And all of the experts said it's going to collapse. There's no way this thing is going to be able to bear all that weight. But he used the same principle of main arteries followed by side arteries in the same proportions as this lily pad, and it stood there for 20 years before there was a fire that weakened it and it fell down. But it worked perfectly because he designed it as God designed it. Another construction that's famous worldwide is based on the human hip. Any guesses what that would be? This was also for a World Fair. It was by an engineer named Gustav, designed in 1889, 163 feet tall, tallest building on earth, held the record by the Egyptians, built probably 3,900 years ago. So the tallest building ever built held the record for about 3,700 years until this building exceeded it. Ta-da! Good guess. The Eiffel Tower. And again, we always built buildings with the weight directly under the support structure. But the human hips, our weight is right down the middle, but our hips are thrown off to the side. And he thought, let's design a really, really tall structure that, again, weighs millions of pounds of metal and see if it'll stand. And it was there for World's Fair. And once again, all the experts said it's going to collapse. But it didn't. It survived totally fine because it was based on God's design. And the same with the medical industry. There have been antibacterial drugs, cancer drugs, pain drugs, anti-itch drugs, topical treatments, all sorts of things for cancer and all sorts of nerve disorders and muscle disorders, all from chemicals found in plants and animals. And this is just a really, really, really partial list. Last example, then I want to talk about the tragedy of what we're training our children to believe. The locust. Scientists noticed, and this is really pertinent given all the things that happened with COVID and antibacterial stuff that microbes become resistant to because they're designed to mutate and change, and those that aren't killed by antibacterial stuff, they then just take over, and then they don't, because they had the original resistance, they're immune to it. So, but they noticed that locusts and dragonflies with these real transparent wings, they have almost no bacteria on their wings. Like every surface imaginable has billions of bacteria. And these guys' wings have like orders of magnitude less bacteria. And they thought there's got to be some really cool antibacterial chemical. And they started looking and they couldn't find anything. No chemical that was there that should be killing bacteria. What they discovered is that these wings are designed with a whole series of little spikes at a nano level, like a molecular level. And that when a bacteria lands on these little spikes, it's like a bed of nails. The weight of the bacteria starts to sag down into them, and then those little spikes puncture the membrane of the bacteria and it dies. So it's an antibacterial surface that uses no chemicals and kills bacteria. Isn't that cool? The scientists are trying to figure out how to put this on doorknobs and bed rails and walls and stuff in hospitals, because you could kill the bacteria without ever using a chemical, and they can't become immune to this. So it's really cool. Same thing with dragonfly wings. Okay, now, I want to give you that full quote that I started with. God says, ask the beasts, they will teach you. The birds of the heaven, they will tell you. The bushes of the earth, they will teach you. The fish of the sea, they will declare to you. Plants, animals, birds, other organisms. We can learn from all of them. But then note what it says. Who among all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? God is the one who did it all. And we can learn from it. And he told us to learn from it. So what does the world do? They pretend God doesn't even exist. And they just throw words at it. They say all these marvels, all these wonders, all these beautiful things that we've been able to develop because of animals we've looked at, they're a result of evolution or mutation or natural selection or adaptation. You hear those words all the time, especially adaptation or the idea of mutation. Mutation's a change. It's like taking a book and just randomly rearranging a few letters and then use that book to make the next copy. And the next copy, you randomly, they're permanent. You randomly change a few more. Is that ever going to change the book into something more useful? Well, let's look at that. Now, when I was young, I had a wagon. I forgot to bring my wagon in. I actually brought one, but it's in the car. But I grew up in the 60s, and a wagon was a form of transportation for little kids. And as my friends are growing up, they're getting bicycles and motorcycles eventually, and eventually cars. But I didn't just want a car or a motorcycle. I didn't just want a bigger wagon. What I really wanted was to have the Starship Enterprise, because I grew up with Star Trek. Now, there's two forms of transportation. One of them's really simple, one of them's really complex. How could you turn a little red wagon in a factory making little red wagons into a factory making the Starship Enterprise? Think of all the parts you'd have to add. The warp drive engines and the decks and the transporter beams and the photon torpedoes and all the stuff on Star Trek. Okay, just imagine the space shuttle. It's got thousands, millions of parts that don't exist in the little red wagon. The difference between a little red wagon and that starship is like the difference between a bacteria and a human being. It's really a very, very good analogy. To turn a bacteria into a human being, you got to add a circulatory system, you got to add eyes, you got to have skin, you got to add muscles, you got to have organs and hearts and livers and stomachs, you got to change its metabolism, you got to somehow get a female and a male bacteria at some point, and they got to both exist at the same moment, or it doesn't do them any good. And they're able to reproduce perfectly fine as a sexless organism, so why would they split into a male and a female? None of it makes any sense. But, if something changes a little bit and that change is useful and it happens over and over again, we're told one animal can slowly modify and change into another animal. And students are shown examples of this, thousands of examples, because things do change. There's all sorts of examples of animal that has an offspring or slowly develops ability that didn't seem to be there before. And the students are shown this, and it's called evolution. And that stuff does happen. But by the way, I'm going to give you the spoiler. Every single example of evolution in action, whether it's dogs modifying to become little dogs and big dogs and fast dogs and slow dogs, or bacteria changing to become resistant to bacteria, to antibiotics, all of it is already programmed into the DNA of the original creature. And we just see the change because that change that's already programmed in has a useful function in a certain environment. But God already built in that ability. Students aren't told that. It's just left out of their thinking. So let's think about a wagon factory. And in this wagon factory, off rolls the wagon. And to get the next wagon, you have to take the information from the first wagon, use that information, rebuild the factory in order to make the second wagon. That's what life does. A bacteria that makes a copy takes the information of the DNA code, uses that information to pull in the chemicals and make the next bacteria. A human being, when they have the next generation, takes all the information from the man and the woman's DNA and pulls in the chemicals to make a little tiny baby that the cells start to split and turn into the next generation of human being based on the information. Well, where do you get the information to build the wagon? In my example, I have a book attached underneath the wagon. So just visualize this. So for the next wagon, you've got to take that book, use the information from the book to build the next wagon. But every single time that wagon makes the next generation of the copies, and bummer, I didn't have it. Again, you just got to visualize this. It's like taking that book filled with page after page after page of information, and now I take the book and I mark out a letter. And then maybe 100 pages later, I'll move a word to a different position. And 100 pages later, I'll add a letter. And 100 pages later, let's say it's 1,000-page books and I make 10 changes. Then I use that book with 10 mistakes, random changes, and I use that book with 10 mistakes to build the next wagon. Has anybody ever read a book and they've seen a typo, a mistake? Suppose you had a word that was misspelled, one word every 100 pages. Do you think you'd still be able to read and comprehend that book? What do you think? Absolutely. Your brain would fill it in. You'd know exactly what it says. So you'd probably be able to use it to make a perfectly good wagon. But then the third wagon would have 20 mistakes. The 10th wagon would have 100 mistakes. So now there's a mistake on every single page. No, every 10 pages. After 100 wagons, there'd be a mistake on every single page. After 1,000 wagons, there'd be 10 mistakes on every page. After 10,000 wagons, and if you're a bacteria, now you're just talking, a few years of evolution, there'd be 1,000 mistakes on every page. At some point, the whole book becomes gobbledygook. Is that process of randomly changing letters and words in the DNA code, which is a language, which is information, which is a code, is that going to slowly transform the wagon into something like an automobile and eventually a starship? See, it is so obvious that the mechanism proposed by evolution could not possibly be true. When you actually think about it, when you actually test it, every mutation is a loss of functioning information. So the students are shown examples like blind cave fish. There are kind of fish and there are salamanders, they live in caves and they literally go blind. And they mutate, so they lose the ability to see. And they function much better in the cave because now the brain isn't trying to understand and comprehend information that's useless. And that brain can be used for other things like enhanced sound and touch and senses and so on. So in every textbook talking about evolution, they'll say, well, blind cave fish, that shows how evolution gave a creature an advantage and how evolution could happen. But did it add any information? Did it add a structure? Did it add something that could be an advancement to that creature? It only gave them an advancement in a very specific, very limited environment. It's exactly like if you were in a movie theater this big with this many people, 500 people, and all of a sudden the lights went out and it was totally black, and someone screamed fire, and there was a blind man sitting there amongst those 500 people. Who would function best in that atmosphere? It would be the blind man. In that very narrow, very limited situation, that very narrow environment that isn't a normal environment, blindness would be an advantage. But does that prove a monkey turned into a human being? It's irrelevant. Proves absolutely nothing. See, it's deception that goes on all around us. But because the educational establishment refuses to acknowledge God, that's all they have left. So you said I could go a couple minutes over. I'm just going to take 2 minutes. The donations you give, everything flows through this ministry. Over the last 5 years, we have went to 4 nations. We've done science assemblies, if sharing the kind of information we've showed here, to students in the public education system. And because we're scientists, bringing a science presentation, we're allowed to go into the public schools, because we give each of the students, and the book they get is this one that's called Explore the World, Knowing God Exists by Looking at Creation. Every student gets one of these books. It's often the only book they own. And then we end with the gospel message in public education systems. Now, we've been to Fiji. We've been to a country called Vanuatu. We've done multiple trips to the Philippines. I just got back 2 weeks ago from Peru, the first trip in 2 years, because worldwide schools have been shut down. They had only opened 2 weeks ago before we arrived to give these presentations in their schools. I want to give you a look at what happens on these trips, and then I'm going to end. Now, this one was in 2019 to the Philippines. We'll go into these big auditoriums. They'll bring all the kids from the schools, and we will show them how science confirms what the Bible has to say about earth, history, and science. We'll show them how it supports the true belief in God, and we'll leave the students with these resource books. And this is kind of what they'll look like, just gathering in open courtyards and open areas or big auditoriums. The presentation starts by talking about how science works. It's a tool. Science doesn't prove truth and reality. It's just a tool for studying how does creation operate. That's all it can do. And then you can learn things and develop products. We show them that the Bible is not just a book of religion. It starts by telling us where everything came from. It starts by talking about biology. Creatures reproduce after their own kind. That's biology. It starts by talking about geology. The rocks, the fossils, the layers are there not because of billions of years, but because of a worldwide flood. And all this points to creation. We show them, like I did this morning, how life could never form itself, that apes did not turn into people. There has been a real worldwide flood. And then we explain, like I'm going to do tomorrow with the students, how people can become so blind to it and why it's left out of their textbooks and thinking. And by the way, in these countries, their textbooks are just filled with evolution. So they're about a generation behind us in deteriorating their belief in God. But I'm telling you that Satan in the world is working hard at getting them in that same position we see ourselves as a country. So there I'm up there on the stage teaching. Here's a sports stadium filled with 2,200 kids, and every one of them got one of these books. So far, we've spoken in 226 schools, over 300 presentations, over 100,000 students in 4 different nations. And they're just hanging over the banisters, listening to every word, intently thinking about what's being said. As we're talking about fossils and dinosaurs, we talk about dinosaurs are all extinct, and then we've got this big blow-up dinosaur that comes running in and chasing us across the stage or attacking the students. You got to make these things visual and emotional, because emotions drive our remembrance. And the students, they get it. They love it. But the books are what really grab them, because they have nothing like this. It's often the only book they own. And you can see the students, they're just really excited. All their classes are in English, so it makes it really easy. They actually shut down their classrooms so the kids could sit and read these books. So we've given away 100,000 books. All their siblings have probably read the books. Their parents have read the books. The neighbors have read the books. We've probably impacted the thinking of 100,000 people in these countries with what we're doing. And we're lining it up with what God's Word has to say. It increases their interest in the Bible. Their English comprehension increases. We've seen that in testing done in the schools we've been to. Their interest in science increases, and salvation's result. Now I'm going to end with this little letter, and I got this at the end of the talk. Don't know what students sent it, but I'm going to read it to you because it's real fine print. Because I want you to know what your donations are going to do, how they're impacting kids around the world. It says, your ministry came to our university. I'm a grade 12 student. I was given the book called Explore the World. I want to express my gratitude for the books because it's amazing. Reading every page strengthened my faith. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm amazed. I love science and your books about science and the Bible. And to be honest, I've been losing my faith since grade 9. Now, it starts in America by the time kids are in grade 2 and 3, okay? When I was in junior high school, we learned about religion from different countries. It had a great impact with me. I said, well, does God even exist? What if the pagans are true? What if the Buddhists or the Hinduism or Islam, which one of those are true? I was really confused. And then here comes science explaining about evolution of the human. And I was confused. What if science is true? What if we really came from ape-like creatures? What if the Big Bang Theory is true? All these questions are bothering me, and it bothered me for years. Then you came, and your book changed my life. It's the best book I've had. Last night I was crying and praying to the Lord. I asked forgiveness for doubting him. I thanked him for letting you come to our university and change my life. I was amazed and asked God to bless you and change more people. My mom told me you were a messenger, and I believe you are from God. I can't express my gratitude enough. I can't believe how many years I was confused, and now I'm enlightened. You're a blessing from above. Every page helps me love my Creator more. You don't know how happy I am to be back with God. That's not just that student. That's the students in America too. So put these tools to use because they really help people connect the Bible with reality, the Bible with truth, the Bible with history. And they have an impact. And thank you for supporting what we're doing and the gifts and just having me here tonight. Thanks. By the way, that's the identical book that I call